the Bill of Rights being purely understood, to think that we're, going to then sail through in this Goshen land or the land of the Lotus Eaters. We're sorely mistaken. But we should see it as A.T. Jones, I believe, saw it. It's not just a time to stand up and hold back the powers of darkness. Why? Not to protect ourselves, but if we can hold it back a little longer, as Abraham dickered with God, it was to save more people. That God will bless. But we need to see this dynamic where we are taking the opportunity to proclaim boldly to people the reason for the times. Do you want your neighbor to say, when things really become so in your face they can't ignore it, and the fire from God is starting to fall around us, that, why didn't you tell me? All you did was sort of object to this law because it was impinging on your rights. Why didn't you tell me that the reason that religious liberty is so important is because God is central to your life, that God is the creator and you owe loyalty to him, not to what rules the state may come up with? When Adventists, I believe, see this more fully, it will impact our evangelism because it truly is the gospel of liberty. It can't be separated. It was no accident that early Adventists so embraced religious liberty. And in fact, if you really look at early Adventist history, they were directly persecuted right out of the gate. At a time when there were about 15,000 Adventists in the whole of the United States, as many as 900 of them had been severely fined and imprisoned, some of them on the chain gangs, for going against the Sunday blue laws in this country, which, especially in the South, they were severe. You were put on the chain gang, with the barely freed slaves in the Reconstruction era. Not good, not good. And yet they were not crying foul per se. They were just upping their game on spreading the word about why they were holding faith. It was only with the 1888 legislative initiative that was too much to sort of talk generally. They had to tackle that in a legislative form. But even then, it was linked to the revival. I was very impressed as a young person. I won't talk much longer, but I was very impressed as a young person coming to this country. And I'll tell you the era. My wife gets mad when I'm not going to tell you my age, but when I signal my age, you are what you are. But I remember 1966. That was the year we came. And between 1966 and 68, when Martin Luther King was killed, the civil rights movement was cataclysmic in this country. We were every city across the United States burned. Luther King was killed. Washington was no exception. You could see it from the General Conference, a great pall of smoke. And on the outer suburbs, there were thousands of National Guard vehicles, uniformed military. The police had tape across the windows. Serious business. But I want to quote from you something that happened in 1968. Martin Luther King, in one of his last public appearances, was an address at the National Cathedral, March 31 of that year. And it was interesting. He told the story, or alluded to the story, of Rip Van Winkle. Even in Australia, I grew up in that story. It's an interesting story by Washington Irving. There's plenty of evidence that he was, like the grim fairy tales, he was somewhat retelling an old European story, but he's putting it in a New England context. But Rip Van Winkle, under the British rule of King George, went up into the hills and met some elfinish people and fell down to sleep and thought he just slept the afternoon out, but he slept a lot longer. And when he woke up and came down to the same inn that he'd left earlier, there was now a picture of George Washington on the wall. And Martin Luther King's theme was, "Are you sleeping through a great revolution?" Like Rip Van Winkle. There's the danger for Adventists. that we will sleep through the final days, or at least a critical part of them. Ellen White said of her day, which was a pretty benign era, well, not really. From a point of history, it was cataclysmic, fight between capital and labor and all sorts of issues on the frontier. It's worth remembering, Ellen White took the train across to the west. That was pretty much the first train. That was the wars with the Indians and the frontier. But still, compared to now, it was a benign era. And now I've lost. So, when she in her era, she says far too many Seventh-day Adventists think far too favorably of the present time. This is still a wonderful country to live in, as Australia or Canada or England. Many Western countries are still relative bulwarks of freedom. But since we're in the context, we don't easily see changes. And compared to the openness and the dedication to liberal democratic principles, we are living under a whole different system now. And I remember writing an editorial years ago called Convergence. It was at the time of perestroika and openness in the then Soviet Union. And we were meanwhile toughening up and tightening. And they were liberalizing and we were tightening. There's got to be no real distinction. You think there is, probably, but you're not easily situated to know it. One thing that impressed me as I traveled around the world, from my father, I was in my teens, to Iran and that amazing place, communist bloc, traveled since then. And I can't, unless it was in the throes of an actual civil war, that moment. There's not a country in the world that the people wouldn't say they were the freest. They compare themselves as their surroundings. And so compare your liberties to your present habits. I can promise you something. If you and I lived as circumspect as the Bible demanded of us, if we went out as boldly as the 70 went from Jesus, and then the disciples following that, and the initial onrush of evangelism, I can promise you will get persecution in this world, in this country, in this church, not this church, maybe, but certainly in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. You will offend people. You will break the laws. Even going door to door with ingathering is not. There are laws against those things. Even speaking out morally on certain behavioral issues, there are laws against those things. Have you ever thought that this means a diminishing of real freedoms, civil freedoms? And I'm convicted, but don't allow your spiritual sensitivities to blend with those. We need to keep that same view. Go ahead. Same view as Daniel. I can't tell you, says Daniel, but the Lord that lives above, he can tell you. I represent him. That's our privilege. We have to keep that mindset. Please come this afternoon and I'll share some other things, more to what's really going on around us. But I want to share something that was written in 1892 by A.T. Jones, or not written, it's written down, but it was one of his presentations. Probably many of you don't even hardly know who A.T. Jones was, and I already identified him, but he's infamous with some people because of his presentations in 1888 on Righteousness by Faith, which Ellen White backed, and many people seem to have trouble understanding, left and right. He was calling for revival, for godliness. But he wasn't a one-shot wonder. He was the speaker at the next two General Conference sessions, and in 1892, he gave the presentation, and he said this, and it's certainly challenging to me. He says, when God calls upon you and me to take a position in allegiance to his law, which will forfeit our lives, that will put our lives in jeopardy, so that some earthly power would deprive us of it, what then? You know, that's happened many times in the past and predicted to happen in the future. But he says, what then? Well, he simply says, let that life go. It will vanish away in a little while anyway. Here is one that will last through all eternity. When he asks you and me to take a course of allegiance to his law that will put into jeopardy and forfeit this vapory, vanishing, mortal life, he says, here is eternal life to begin with. Therefore, and there was a break, but this is his conclusion, a man or woman who has only this life to start with need not start with the third angel's message. Because when the test comes that this life is at stake, he will stick to it.